Меня зовут Жак. Привет, меня зовут Юрий. Я люблю танцевать.
Меня зовут Маша.
Are you recording?
Yep.
Okay.
Меня зовут Катя.
Здравствуйте, меня зовут Володя, и я люблю пиво!
Меня зовут Коля. Я люблю джинсы.
Меня зовут Надя. Я люблю конфетти.
Меня зовут Аня.
Меня зовут Света, и у меня есть 5 кошек.
Я родилась 1994. Я родилась 1994. Когда я была маленькая, я много говорила по-русски. Ну, сейчас немножко.
Go ahead.
Меня зовут Лилия. Я из Америки.
What do I say?
Меня зовут...
Меня зовут...
Я говорю по-русски!
In early October of 2013, our group found out we had been accepted on the abroad titled The Old and New Russia. Starting in November 2013, Russia was in the news more and more. The president of Ukraine had suddenly decided to abandon an upcoming agreement that would allow closer trade ties with the European Union, and instead, he decided to implement a closer trade relationship with Russia.
February 2010. Pro-Russian leader Yanukovych is elected president. Yanukovych abandons a popular trade agreement with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. Protests erupt once again in Kiev.
This majorly upset many Ukrainians who were looking forward to the economic growth from the trade with the EU. This conflict continued to ensue as we got deeper into the preparation for our program.
In January, we began to study Russian, 5 days a week. We began Russian and language culture class and bonded over the fact that learning Russian was insanely hard and also really awesome. In February, the Ukrainian president fled to Russia and the rebels took over the parliament.
They're saying that the Russians need to leave. They're saying they don't want any more bloodshed. And right behind me here in Kiev, they're still mourning the people who died in those bloody protests.
This escalated into Russia declaring that the peninsula in Ukraine, called Crimea, actually belongs to Russia.
And dozens of people died there. They're still mourning. They don't want to see any more bloodshed. They're trying to go to the international community to make sure that the sovereignty of Ukraine is respected, Jake.
Their rationale was that up until 1954, Crimea belonged to Russia, and also that 60% of the population in Crimea is Russian and speaks Russian. Increasingly serious military action was being taken by both sides. The U.S. started sanctioning Russia and declared its annexation of Crimea illegal.
February 2014, 18 people, including 7 police, are killed during riots in Kiev. Hundreds others are wounded. Video shows uniformed snipers firing at protesters armed with makeshift shields. International efforts to broker a peace agreement falter and protesters seize more government buildings. Pro-Russian gunmen seize key buildings in the Crimean Peninsula, where Russia's Black Sea Navy is based. March 2014. Russia approves the use of military force in Ukraine. Russian forces move towards Crimea. Ukraine puts defense forces on full alert. Western governments in response to Russia.
After many discussions with our group and with the abroad office, it was decided in mid-April that our abroad would be better suited in Nice, France.
Why Nice, you might ask? Well, there's been a great connection between Nice and Russia since the 19th century. not only with the Russian nobility who loved the climate and natural beauty of the area, but also with the lifestyle and luxury. Many Russians have taken refuge in Nice over the past years and have created a rather large population of Russians in the city. For instance, Nice has 2 Russian Orthodox churches, the Museum of Arts, which is a former palace built by a member of the Russian nobility, and many Russians are buried in the local cemeteries. Alain and Hillary decided Nice would provide us with the most Russian people and culture in a location where we would have freedom to explore and learn on our own as well. In Nice, we encountered many Russian tourists around town, and some of our host families for our group were Russian as well.
On a typical day in Nice, we would wake up bright and early, have a scrumptious breakfast prepared by our homestay mom, and then walk through the quiet but alive streets of Nice to our language school. For 4 hours, we studied the Russian language. The alphabet became second nature to us, and we worked diligently to learn as much vocabulary as we could. Those of us with Russian homestays were able to directly apply what we learned in class back home. We even learned some famous Russian songs. Our teacher spoke only some English, so we were really immersed in Russian language. In Russian, there are 6 declensions, so you say the ending of words differently depending on their function in the sentence. This is why our teacher said that speaking Russian can be as complicated but fun as playing chess. By the end of our study, we greatly improved in our understanding of how these worked, and we were able to apply them with more accuracy.
After 4 hours of class, we would go out to eat in one of the many restaurants around the school. The diversity of food choices showed us the rich multicultural history of Nice. It was fun to try to order in French after being immersed in Russian all morning, and this made for some funny stories. After lunch, we would either stay in Nice and explore or do homework, or we would take an excursion to another city along the French Riviera. We went to Antibes, Aix, and Cagnes. These trips helped us experience the train and bus systems in France, an important aspect of the French lifestyle. Because these modes of transportation were so important to us, we empathized with the French during the train strikes that took place in the last week of our trip.
On Saturdays, we took day trips to Beaulieu, Menton, Monaco, and Cannes. At each place, we experienced certain aspects of French culture and history. We went to many art museums with Renaissance, Impressionist, and modern art, and learned the importance of art to French culture. We went to many old ornate cathedrals and churches, some standing on their own, some with just a door opening onto a busy street. In most all the cities we went, these became quiet, familiar sanctuaries for us. Religion has a huge historical role in both France and Russia, and we got to feel that in these old cathedrals. Because of how old Nice is, everywhere we went we learned about history, and were able to relate French history to Russian history. We will talk about some of the things we learned about history, art, and religion on our abroad, knowledge that gave our trip more color and meaning.
On our first weekend in Nice, we took a trip to former Roman bath grounds that were left over from the Romans who were the first inhabitants of Nice. Visiting the Roman ruins helped to put into perspective how the culture of Nice had been shaped for centuries. Being at the ruins gave us context into how relatively new Nice is to being a part of France. Similarly to the United States, we came to the understanding that Nice is a cultural melting pot. Existent in this melting pot include aspects of Russian, French, North African, and Middle Eastern cultures.
Russia also has an extremely long and complex history. This history is highlighted by turmoil and a culture of endurance that has allowed its citizens to identify themselves with a strong sense of national identity. Contrary to Nice, Russia is hardly considered a cultural melting pot. Russia has had many events in its lengthy history that have helped to shape its identity. Most notably, the Mongol invasion that lasted over a century prevented Russia from participating in the cultural progression that other nations experienced during the Renaissance period.
Another invasion that Russia endured was the 19th century French invasion led by French Emperor Napoleon. This invasion is memorable for the Russian army's perseverance and the brutality of Russian winters that crippled the French army. Similarly to Russia, Nice was constantly invaded, which hindered Nice from developing a culture of its own.
The Russian people loved the idea of having a strong ruler to guide and protect them. They believed that the Tsars were always looking out for their best interest. Tsars were commonly given the name Little Father because the people believed that, like a father, the Tsars would protect them. If something bad were to happen, the people believed it was only because the Tsars were too far away to know about it.
Позвольте вас познакомить с моей дочерью.
Я имею удовольствие быть знакомым, ежели графиня помнит меня. Разрешите предложить тур вальса.
Russian nobility played a significant role in the history of Russia. Understanding how key royalty was to the Russian culture helped prepare us for when we would venture to places like Monaco and experience the extravagant lifestyle there.
We visited 3 palaces during our travels. They were meant to illustrate the extravagant lifestyle of the wealthy, which was the case of the Russian nobility in Russia prior to the 1917 revolution. Our first week, we visited 2 luxury villas, which introduced us to the lifestyle of 2 Russian families during the early 1900s, which mirrored the lives of the Russian nobility.
The first house we visited was Villa Carlos. This villa was built in the early 1900s by French archaeologist Theodore Reynac and his wife Fanny Can. Fanny was a daughter of Maximilian Can and Betty Euphrasy of the Euphrasy family. The Euphrasy family was a Ukrainian Jewish banking and oil dynasty that made a very large fortune, one that allowed the construction of such an extravagant villa. This villa was designed and decorated to imitate a luxurious Greek villa. It had white columns, statues, and an open sunroof in the middle of the villa. While not Russian in style, it did show us a sense of luxury and wealth common in the Russian palaces we would have seen in Russia. The second villa we visited was actually inspired by the Villa Carlos and was built a couple years later. It was constructed by Baroness Beatrice de Rothschild, who was a member of the Rothschild banking family, and the wife of banker Baron Maurice de Euphrasy. This was the source of wealth necessary to construct this luxurious villa that overlooked the Mediterranean Sea. It was filled with antique furniture, paintings, and sculptures from her large art collection. Our third experience of wealth was when we took our trip to Monaco. We noticed the wealth right when we arrived at the train station, which was very clean, almost too clean. This sense of wealth continued as we walked through the city and saw fancy cars, an extravagant casino, and clean streets. It was as if anything that would make Monaco look bad was somehow tucked away. Because Monaco is such a wealthy place, having the highest GDP per capita in the world, they can afford to clean everything up and maintain the image of a pristine city.
During our trip to Cannes, we took a ferry to a neighboring island named Sainte Marguerite. There has been a prison and a military base on the island for centuries. This is the same prison that inspired the popular film The Man in the Iron Mask. We walked through the now empty prison cells where some Christian pastors had been held for decades because of their religious beliefs. This gave us an appreciation for the long history of France and the progress in terms of religious freedom that has been made.
The Russian Revolution of 1905 was in protest of the harsh conditions that Russians were going through due to rapid industrial growth with a weak agricultural system that could not support their needs. Later, World War I cost Russia millions of lives and put the country into economic depression. The people were discontent with their government's ineffectiveness. There was a class division between the ordinary working people and the elites who controlled everything. In February 1917, riots were held in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. Tsar Nicholas responded with army action, but the army soon turned against him, and he was forced to abdicate. The Russian Revolution ended the long-standing Tsarist rule in Russia. A provisional government ruled Russia until October, when Vladimir Lenin led the Bolsheviks in a second revolution. In 1918, the Tsar family was executed, and a 4-year civil war followed. Lenin established the new Soviet government, inspired by the communist principles of Karl Marx. The Soviet Union would exist until 1991.
During the Soviet era, the people liked how Joseph Stalin was strong and modernized the country. He created the image of a great Russia, one that people would be proud to be a part of.
Today's Russians admire Vladimir Putin for many of the same leadership qualities that Stalin embodied. Many feel he is reviving Russia's former power and nationalistic pride. Whether it is Stalin or Putin, the people look for strong leadership roles to rule the country. The strongman concept is something that is still deeply rooted in the Russian culture today and can help explain some of the cultural differences.
The French Revolution of 1789 also resulted from economic crises and a preceding costly defeat in war. Both of the revolutions overthrew long-standing dynasties and new leaders took over. Napoleon in France and Lenin in Russia. Just as the Soviet government was established through revolution, the French also embody a revolutionary spirit. We experienced this spirit in France when our trains were delayed and sometimes canceled due to the train strikes in Paris. Hence, strikes and protesting for one's rights are still a part of French culture to this day.
For many people, the thought of France is inevitably linked with the thought of artists and artistry. It's a classic stereotypical image of Paris. The artist with his colorfully stained clothing, smoking a cigarette while he paints a view of the city, to indulge in a foamy cappuccino afterward. France has always been a haven for artistic expression. Even during the height of strict religious rule, France was a powerhouse for producing art of all kinds: fashion, architecture, painting, ballet, sculpture, the list goes on. Many famous artists of the 19th and 20th centuries visited the French Riviera to live and be inspired by its beautiful landscapes. Although many of the well-known artists from that time are French, such as Renoir and Monet, both Impressionists born in the 1840s, some of the most famous artists that followed them were not French, but spent much of their time painting in France. For example, Pablo Picasso, born in Spain, and Marc Chagall, born in Russia.
Nice is home to a Marc Chagall museum. It includes a series of Bible-inspired paintings detailing important events in Jewish history from the Old Testament, most notably the Exodus, which Chagall himself could relate to in his own life. We spent a lot of time learning about the life and works of Marc Chagall. He was highly important for us to study because he was the embodiment of both a Russian and French soul, with the added element of his Jewish faith. He gave us key insights as to what it meant to be limited by Russia's narrow perspective on art and religion. He first moved to France in 1910, at just over 20 years old, to study painting. He wrote that he was intoxicated by Paris and was just happy breathing Parisian air. He returned to Russia a few years later, but experienced a halt in his work because of the rise in Marxism and the new rigidness of society there, so he began to travel once more. It was then that he came to the French Riviera for the first time, remarking, "There in the south, for the first time in my life, I saw that rich greenness, the like of which I had never seen in my own country." He experienced a harrowing escape from France during World War II, having to flee once again from a country that he had begun to adopt as his own, but was able to return to France after the war. He settled down in Nice, our own home in France, and left his beautiful legacy there. We were also able to visit the Mediterranean home of Pierre-Auguste Renoir, famous for his impressionist portraits. It was important for us to go there because it gave us a sense of respect for the history and home of a revered person, which is a salient part of Russian culture. Russians have shown deep reverence for their heroes of history, especially those that have left a cultural legacy, and are often found weeping at important historical sites even today.
One of the greatest figures in Russian history is Alexander Pushkin. Pushkin is considered the greatest poet of Russia and the founder of modern literature. He was born in Moscow in 1799 to a distinguished family. His mother was the granddaughter of one of Peter the Great's right-hand men, and his father's family was of the highest feudal rank. He was raised to write and speak French and live a European lifestyle, although he was constantly surrounded by his family's Russian tales of old and learned to appreciate the histories and culture of Russian commoners. His early works circulated the ideas of the Decembrists, the early Soviets, making him a sort of spokesperson for the group. Since the Decembrists' views were revolutionary, Pushkin's poems were rejected by the government and he was exiled from St. Petersburg. Despite the fact that he was rejected as an author during his time, the people of Russia today revere him as one of the most heroic and honest voices of Russia of all time. He is noted for his literary contribution to Russian history and for his role as a cornerstone of the Russian national identity.
During our abroad, we experienced the importance of Russian Orthodoxy in contrast with the importance of French Catholicism. We visited several churches and we talked about the history of religion, and we realized how much Russian religion has defined Russian culture.
Russia has an interesting history regarding religion. Orthodox Russian Catholicism, also known as Russian Orthodoxy, has existed since early in the 10th century. After the split of the Catholic Church in 1054, known as the Great Schism, Russia adopted Catholic Orthodoxy as a national religion, which grew to become a national symbol of identity and power. Not only did it signify that Russia was going to have different religious beliefs from Western European Catholic countries, but it also meant that all facets of the Russian state and the Church would be forever set apart from the Roman Apostolic Catholic Church and Western European states. It ultimately meant that Russia would forever be different. These differences were used by the Russian state to define Russian culture, and it constitutes a symbol of national pride.
While we were in Nice, all 10 of us were able to continue our academic study of Russian language with our teacher, Kristina, a native of Nizhny Novgorod, Russia.
Oh, well done. Our poker faces are awful, guys. Yeah.
Aha! You're not Jake, so you're Kendall. And you're Jake.
Along with these classes 4 days each week, about half of us were fortunate enough to be hosted by Russian families who are now living in Nice. This allowed us the opportunity to be completely immersed in the language the entire time we were in our homestays.
60% of our group were with Russian families, and 40% were with French families. The diverse families allowed us to collectively gain a much broader and complete understanding of both the French and Russian cultures. I was very grateful for the opportunity to stay with a Russian family. Family is one of the most important aspects to most Russians. Sometimes there could be 3 generations, the grandparents, parents, and children of a family living in a single small house. They love coming together as a big family, especially during special occasions. There's also a Russian tradition that has been instilled into every Russian. Everyone should love their own home and protect their family. During our abroad in Nice, Joey and I quickly noticed a strong sense of family connection. We stayed in a small 2-bedroom apartment. Within this small apartment lived a mother and her daughter, plus the mother's cousin and her son. Now adding Joey and I created for an interesting situation. Our family was willing to give up one of their 2 rooms and 2 separate beds so that Joey and I may be happy. The moment we walked through the door, we weren't just American guests staying with them. We became a part of their family. Throughout the entire experience, we could feel the love and protection that our host family provided. They provided us with many delicious, authentic Russian meals. They would constantly check in on us to see how we were doing or if we needed anything. It was truly a very enjoyable living experience for both Joey and myself.
In our Russian homestay, we saw how our host sister led a bilingual life, speaking Russian at home with her mom and Russian friends, and speaking and studying in French at school. She held on to and cherished her Russian heritage, while at the same time embracing the French culture. She was also enthusiastic about studying English, which inspired us since we also had the challenge of communicating with 2 new languages. Living in the new home and having to completely switch from speaking English to speaking Russian was challenging, especially at first. We were fortunate enough to have a host mom who, although she spoke no English, was eager to lovingly correct our mistakes in the language and explain to us the proper way to communicate something.
One of the best things about my homestay experience was that we had many other boarders staying with us from all over the world. Many of the other people staying with us were from other language schools taking French. Every night we would all sit and have dinner together, and it was so neat getting to talk and learn about everyone else. It definitely added to my awareness of cross-cultural understanding. I'm so grateful for the experience of becoming a better global citizen.
My homestay turned out to be a beautiful learning and growing experience for me. The first week was full of communication issues, being that my family predominantly spoke French and only a little English. Working from a spiritual basis, I was able to apply themes from the lesson that week to work towards harmonious resolution. I found my spiritual mindset manifesting itself in our relationship. Seeing this beautiful unfoldment helped me see that love is a universal language.
Overall, our unique experience helped us with cross-cultural understanding as we were able to experience Russian culture and language in France.
It gave us a richer understanding of the people and culture of both countries than we would have experienced in Russia alone.
We experienced challenges, but our group reflected the resilience that is characteristic of Russia itself. One of our biggest takeaways was learning about this resilience.
Russia as a nation has endured and overcome centuries of war, invasion, occupation, and cultural struggles.
Our change of locations was a hurdle and an opportunity that bonded our group together.
Prior to the start of our Russian program, we barely knew each other. But now we are our own little Russian semya, which is Russian for family.
The adversity we faced caused us to focus more on God's direction and purpose for our abroad, rather than following what may have been the original plan.
We were all able to apply Christian Science throughout the entire abroad, which ultimately helped our whole experience unfold harmoniously. This focus on Christian Science also paved the way for in-depth and multicultural learning.